Hi there, I'm Twiggy Shay, and before we get started on this video, I want to let you guys know exactly what the purpose of it is. So, as a lot of you may know based on my multiple thanks to my awesome patrons, I have a Patreon. It helps me pay to continue making content and support myself so I don't have to spend too many hours at a day job. As a reward for certain tiers on that Patreon, I'll be giving away physical copies and free audiobook copies of my novel, The Nothing Gate, which I wrote myself over the past 11 years. This video is essentially a free sneak peek at the first chapter and prologue of the book. I figure let you guys have a little taste, and if you're willing to shell out some little extra money every month and you have that money to spend, and you want to spend it on this, well, you know what you're getting into. And if you're not interested, that's fine too. Anyways, without further ado, let's hop right in to The Nothing Gate. Volume 1 of the Book of Runin by Ben Nelson. Dedicated to my friend, classmate, and cohort Nicholas P. Spiroff, who always was there to keep me motivated. It's thanks to you that this project was started, and it's thanks to you that now it's finished. Prologue. The two men meet late at night. The first, a smaller man, carries a small bundle of swaddled cloths in his arms. The larger man bears nothing. His tall frame is robust and powerful, broad shoulders tapering to a slim waist. He moves like the night itself, slithering between shadows as if he is one himself. Age hasn't slowed him in the slightest, nor has the loss of a hand. An ironwork hook dangles from one shattered wrist, the glinting of moonlight off the metal the only sign that he is there at all. "Avat Nuil, old friend," the smaller man says to the larger. He lays his bundle in the dirt, and it wriggles wildly, finally unwrapping itself to reveal a thin, undernourished infant, scrabbling his little bony legs and arms in the cloths. The larger man eyes the boy critically. "And to you as well. So this is him?" The child crawls about curiously in the dust, small blue eyes trying to take in every sight and sound that they see. Even this young, a flop of flaming red hair sprawls messily atop his round head. "Please, the boy won't last much longer out on the streets." "He's very lucky to have made it this far." "Luck won't last forever, and his hands are getting curious." "If you're afraid he'll end up a thief, why deliver the child to me?" "You're the only one I know that won't immediately turn him over to the Ashuri." "I still might, you know." "You're a bad liar. You know what would become of him if those self-righteous fools got a hold of him." "Why not allow the child to live with you?" "I have, but for how long can I be expected to care for him? Especially with that flaming red hair, he'd stand out like a sore thumb among the nobility. I can't claim him as my own child, he doesn't look Morian." "On that we can agree. The boy's as pale as the belly of a snake. Who are the parents?" "You remember Bergan Lanautas, do you not?" "And where is he?" "Gone. I don't know where, no one does." "And the mother?" "The poor, sweet little Renea Linforcine. How long could anyone expect such a soft-spoken little Teliate girl to stand living in a place like Aradhuir? This city has grown rotten in these past years. It's hardly a place for someone as pretty as her. Besides, her husband isn't what one would call an easy man." "Wasn't? Where did she go?" "Ran off with some Vajian man. She took the younger son with her, but the firstborn was left behind." "I never took her to be so cruel. A motherless home for the first child she bore? Unbelievable." "I don't know why she did it, but the point is she did. And things in the palaces are growing difficult. With that young man Baladin making a bid for the title of Ashuri, I don't trust him, and I don't trust him to keep the boy safe as a ward of the state." "And with nowhere else to turn, you look to me to take him in." "It is best this way. Then he'll at least be safe with you. I can make no such guarantee." "And I can? I'm not exactly a friend of the Ashuri the way you are. You can't expect him to be any safer in the company of a brigand like me." "Hardly a brigand anymore, are you? Besides which, Shanid could use a brother." "Don't bring my son into this. Don't ever.
I can't think of any other way to make you see pity. For the sake of the ancestors, I'm not asking much of you. He cannot live with me in the palace. Ashuri Vaspan would never allow it. He'd assume the boy was mine, and with the state the Ashuri are in now, he'd assume I'd been unfaithful to the wife he chose for me. I'd be lucky to escape with a head still on my shoulders, much less my position intact. You are exempt from such pressures.
Perhaps, but you're still asking more than you realize. Perhaps it is easy in the palace to feed and clothe and protect a child, but on the streets, money is harder to come by. You're asking me to clear a place at my table, to make my children share bread with a stranger.
Please, I'll find a way to repay you, but do something for him. At the very least, teach him to fend for himself if you don't want to raise him.
We both know there's only one trade I could ever teach him in. My wife wouldn't approve.
She wouldn't approve of you turning him out on the streets either.
Suppose for a moment that I was to say yes, hypothetically.
Then the boy lives, returns home with you, and we can both sleep soundly tonight, with clear consciences.
And if I refuse?
I never took you to be a killer of children.
There are other men. Ask one of them.
I can't trust anyone else in this city. Not like I trust you. We grew up together. Why won't you listen to me?
I suppose you won't ever let me turn this down, will you? The larger man shook his head in defeat.
I can't let the boy die. Bergan Altas may have been a hard man, but he was a good one too. I owe him this much, and so do you. Remember that incident with the Turian bounty hunters and that knife in the dark? Who got you out of that mess?
Altas did.
And this is Altas's boy.
If you insist, and as I do still owe Bergen, I suppose I have no choice but to accept.
You have my thanks, old friend.
I only hope I will not regret this. What is his name?
Sato. Sato Lanaltas.
A fine name.
Chapter 1. 20 years later.
The warm evening air was muggy and thick with aromas as Seto Lanaltas roamed the streets of Aradhuir city. Located deep within the desert nation of Marur, Aradhuir served as one of the 5 leading cities of the country. It also served as home to one Ashuri Baladin, one of the 5 leading Ashuri of Marur, widely considered to be one of the most cunning and certainly the most ruthless of the leading families. The Ashuri's power was supposed to be balanced, with each one cancelling out the other, but Baladin's intellect and pitiless nature had allowed him to rise even higher than his brethren, and claim a place as the true ruler of Marur. Under his rule, the desert nation, already rich, grew even more so, its vast arms reaching to encompass all of the southern world. Tales of its magnificent horses, silks, spice, and glasswork spread over mountains and across the seas until the whole world sought out Morian goods above all others. After Baladin took control, and the other Ashuri all but ceded power to him, the young lord had also taken advantage of Marur's wealthy oil wells, increasing his profits. So wealthy was Marur, in fact, and so expansive their trade routes, that the Morian tongue became convenient for almost everyone to learn, transforming over a few decades into a universal language. Seto reflected upon this as he wandered the empty side streets of Aradhuir, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the sleepy gazes of the few city guardsmen who had actually bothered to stay at their posts on this particular evening. Even if they were tired, their curved shodrels, weapons that Marur was famous for, were more than a match for Seto, armed only with his wits. He was rather fond of keeping all his digits firmly attached to the rest of him, and besides which, men like himself lived off of the swift work of their fingers. Losing them would leave Seto with very few skills to fend for himself in a tough city like Aradhuir. Funny, really, he reflected thoughtfully, that one of the world's richest nations breeds the most desperate of rogues. He supposed Baladin, although able to accomplish many things in his long term of lordship, could not spare either the time or the effort to focus on petty thieves like himself. Seto fought the urge to giggle boyishly at the thought that Baladin would soon come to regret not expunging the rabble from the city when he could. This month in particular, Seto thought deviously, would prove to be fatal to Ashuri Baladin. Fatal being figurative, of course, he amended quickly. For this month the Grand City, or rather the Ashuri's palace, would be home to the Sirshat Melos, the annual meeting between the 5 Ashuri families. Word of this momentous occasion, which had only visited Arad-Huir twice before within the 20-year span of Baladin's rule, had driven the city into a frenzy of wild festive excitement. Festivals such as this would bring with it good food, better wine, and of course the honor of playing host for the esteemed lords. Seto too had been excited to hear of such news, but not, he decided, for the same reasons as his countrymen. Marur was already home to vicious bandits and barbaric desert-dwelling tribesmen, but Arad-Huir would attract even more ruffians with the news of the Sirshat Melos. Indeed, within the criminal underworld, Seto had noted a sudden swell in the number of unseemly characters to flood the streets. Desert scoundrels, common footpads, and bounty hunters crept about the alleys and skulked in the dark corners of the city. The variety of criminals to flock to the city rivaled the different merchants and craftsmen to do the same. Seto had even heard rumors that a deadly group of swamp-dwelling Turian assassins had slipped silently into the city. Rumors only, he hoped, as a nobleman's death would make things all the more difficult for him. Seto's eyes roamed aimlessly around the walls of the dirty buildings surrounding him, taking in the abandoned crates and barrels stacked near the sides of the buildings. Once they had been filled with expensive fruits, fine wines, and other such sundry, but now held only musty air and dust. The festivities this month had been lavish indeed, but the real prize would come tonight. Assuming, of course, that he succeeded. Otherwise... Seto's thoughts flashed quickly to Dert and his false hand. He rubbed his own right wrist appreciatively. Much as he respected the man to take him in as a child, he didn't idolize him enough to seek a similar fate. Besides which, the old man would never let me hear the end of it if I did lose a hand, Seto chided himself. No, failure was a non-option in this scenario. Success was the only available road down which to travel, and Seto planned to traverse it boldly. At this hour of the evening, the palace guardsmen would be drowsy and lazy, much easier for Seto to get around, and he wasn't afraid of the high sandstone wall that separated the Ashuri from the rest of the city. What he was dreading was dealing with his brother. Seto and Shanit may not have actually been blood brothers, but when Seto was taken in by Dad Rishan, Shanit's father, they had quickly formed a fraternal bond with one another. In youth, the two young boys had agreed on almost everything, but as they grew older and Seto turned to burglary, Shanit had turned down the path of the law instead, which made it rather difficult to get anything properly burgled, as the eyes and ears of the Ashuri were living in your own home alongside you. Still, despite it all, Seto had managed to inch his way up the social ladder and make a name for himself in Arad-Huir as a minor nuisance to the otherwise stalwart Ashuri Baladin. Shanit, on the other hand, had also risen in his own way, and as Seto approached the high walls of the Ashuri's palace, a tall figure stepped out of the shadows to meet him. He was larger than most men, at 6 feet and 5 inches in height, swathed in the uniform of the Ashuri's personal elite guard, the Executioners. Shanit had entered their ranks only a year or so ago, with the barren belt of a new entry, but Seto was dismayed to see 5 hands, 6 scalps, and 3 tongues hanging from his belt now. The pieces taken from the criminals he'd punished in just the last year. Not as many as some of the other executioners Seto had seen about the city, but impressive for a single year. The grisly trophies acted as symbols of rank for executioners of Marur, badges of honor attesting to their unmatched status among the leaders of the nation. The uniform only added to the mystique that surrounded the terrifying figures. Black cuirasses, tooled with the names of the victims they took, and fashioned in interlocking lacquered plates resembling a scorpion carapace, belted with their wide studded belts. Their boots were soft-soled, enabling them to move through the city in silence and appear as if from nowhere. The black cloth hoods on their heads obscured every inch of skin from the crowns of their heads to the tops of their shoulders, leaving only the dark eyes glittering out. but most terrifying were the tools of an executioner's trade, which helped them to enforce their reputation as Marur's elite warriors. Issued to every executioner of Marur was a 5-foot-long greatsword, with a massive blade almost a full 4 inches in width. The hilts were fashioned from black iron and bore long, trailing red ribbons from the pommels like bloody bandages. Each ribbon signified a year of service. The blades were blue steel, etched with ancient Morian runes reciting the executioner's oaths of loyalty and vows of chastity. The end of the blade, rather than ending in a pointed tip, was squared off, allowing the wedge to be shoved straight through a prisoner's neck from behind. Originally, so the legend went, the blades of executioners had been smaller, only the size of a standard northern straightsword, but times had changed, and as crime grew, so too did the weapons used against it. Massive, heavy, and intimidating, the swords of Morian executioners were terrifying to behold. Shanit bore his with pride and practiced ease. He'd taken off his hood as Seto approached to reveal his dark, dusky skin and cropped black hair. His flat nose and slightly slanted eyes marked him as a Morian citizen, unlike Seto, whose fair skin and fiery hair suggested a more westerly heritage. "To be honest, I was really hoping you wouldn't show," Seto began as his adoptive brother knotted one hand in his collar and dragged him into an alleyway. "Why not?" Shanit hissed. "Because you were afraid I would turn you into the Ashuri? You should know better than that, Seto." "No, because I was afraid you would try to talk me out of this entire affair. A fear which was, evidently, well-founded." With an exasperated sigh, Shanit let Seto go and stepped back to look at him face to face. "Listen, Seto, just once in your life. You know I've been patient with you. I've never ratted you out to my fellows or divulged your plans, even when it's risked my own career. But this time I'm taking it too far. You aren't going to let your brother throw his life away. Yes, can we speed this up? I've somewhere I need to be." "Damn it, Seto, this is your life we're talking about." "Relax. Father got caught and they didn't kill him. Besides, we both know I won't get caught." He fingered the ring in his pocket nervously. Despite his bravado, the thought of being arrested did strike fear into his heart. "No, they didn't kill Father. They just cut off his good left hand and threw him in the gutter. If not for Mother, he'd have died in the filth. And even so, Father got caught stealing from merchants, not from the Ashuri themselves. If you get caught and they decide to kill you, there won't be anything I can do about it." Seto shook his head. "So don't sweat it. If they catch me, it's not like anything happens to you." Shanit's fist slammed into the side of the wall in frustration. "By the ancestors!" he whispered fiercely. "I don't give a damn what might happen to me. I care about keeping my brother alive." "Then go back home, get something to eat, and say a real prayer to the ancestors to see me back safe and sound. Nothing you say is going to stop me. You're aware I don't have to say a word to drag you out of this scheme. So what? You knock me out and haul me back home over your shoulder? How embarrassing would that be? Honestly, Shanit, I have a reputation to uphold." Shanit let out another sigh, and his shoulders slumped. "You're committed to seeing this through, aren't you? It's not obvious? Then I won't stop you." Shanit stepped aside to let Seto out of the alleyway and back into the streets running alongside the palace walls. Seto made to walk around him, but Shanit grabbed his arm as he passed. "A trick? But you damn better come back home tomorrow, with all of your pieces still attached. Mother would throw a fit if you lost even a fingernail doing this." "Ah, don't worry your head about it," Seto grinned, shaking Shanit off. "I'll come back. All of me. And I might even bring something back with me." Shanit smiled and shook his head. "Same old Seto Althos. Good luck, brother mine." "Vat nu il, an executioner?" Seto bowed to him with mock formality. "Run along now before someone sees you with me." Shanit nodded curtly back to him before melting into the shadows lining the dusty streets. "For the sake of the ancestors, be careful," his brother whispered to him. "Quit worrying, you ass, and just go." Seto hissed back at him and pretended to begin studying the sandstone wall intently, as if looking for a way to climb over it. In reality, Seto hadn't the slightest clue how to begin scaling so massive a structure, but he didn't want Shanit to see what he was really doing. The ring in his pocket felt unnaturally warm, almost alive.
"Just another minute or so,"
Seto muttered to it under his breath. The moment that he felt confident that Shanit had disappeared into the night and wasn't going to see him, Seto slipped the ring onto his finger and felt a sudden thrill of power stir his blood in a way that no other sensation could. He felt so mighty, so breathtakingly powerful, that Seto was almost certain that, had he wished it, he could leap straight up over the wall. But instead of doing that, Seto fit the ring snugly on his finger, just to be certain he didn't lose it, and began to walk the perimeter of the wall, looking for the main gate. It wasn't that he was certain he could fight his way in, or even sneak past the guards near the gate. He just favored his method to having to climb up over the wall. Whether he used rope or climbing spikes, the result would be the same. He would still reach the top winded, sweaty, and with no way of safely getting down the other side. And sneaking past the guards, though plausible, was risky. Even if he made it past the main gates unnoticed, there were more soldiers posted up the winding path leading to the doors of the palace, now flung wide for the nobility to enjoy the fresh, cool evening air. As he approached the main gate, still hopefully out of both sight and earshot of the gatekeepers, Seto crouched low and lifted the ring to his lips. His other hand went down to the dirt and scooped up a handful of dust and sand.
"Hide me,"
he whispered to the ring, casting the dust into the air about him. Seto felt a rippling in the atmosphere, and the air shimmered around him. In a moment, everything was still. Seto raised up one hand before his face to look at it. As far as he could tell, he was still very much visible, but then he had always been able to see through the illusions the sand helped him cast. And it was the sand that had allowed him to cast the illusion around himself. Seto had ascertained that long ago. In fact, he'd been casting illusions before he'd even found the ring. But when he wore it, the mirages he casted became 100 times more potent, possessing sound, smell, taste, and even texture if Seto put enough effort into it. Besides just amplifying his power, the ring did other things too. Ordinarily, even conjuring minor illusions drained Seto of energy and strength, leaving him winded and with a pain in his chest. While wearing it, Seto found he could continue throwing up false images as much as he pleased. It was for such a reason as this that Seto wore the ring tonight. If he was going to pull off a job like this one, he needed to consider all the angles. Without the ring, he would still be able to pass by the gate, but what if he needed to hide himself again? No, the risk was too great, and Seto refused to take chances when dealing with people as dangerous as he knew the Ashuri to be. There were downsides to the ring too, however. Seto had found that ever since he had found it, sleep had become difficult to achieve, and once he was asleep, he was always plagued by dreams that he couldn't remember by the time he woke up. He only knew that they were terrifying, and always left him in a cold sweat by the time he woke, dry heaving, panting, and taking in huge gulps of air. And every dream was punctuated with a tugging, jerking feeling in the pit of his stomach, just behind his navel, as if 100 tiny fishhooks had dug into his guts and were being pulled at whenever he slept. Seto had taken to removing the ring whenever he went to sleep, in order to try and avoid the frightening dreams that it brought with them. Hoping that his illusion was sound, Seto straightened and made for the gate, taking care to stick to the shadows just in case. If he wasn't actually invisible, then this way he'd still remain fairly hidden. Luckily, however, neither of the two gate guards noticed him sidling past them, but continued to gaze out drearily into the near-empty streets. Despite the festivities in other parts of the city, the roads leading to the Ashuri's palace were closed to traffic. The guards were more a formality than anything else. No one was here. "No one but me," Seto amended, grinning like a loon as he stepped silently past the threshold of the gate and made his way up the long winding path to the palace doors. The other watchmen, posted at intervals along the paved way, never noticed him as Seto slipped past them and closer to the doors. At this point, he needed to make a decision. With the ring, he could probably keep his invisibility sustained long enough to sneak through the celebrating Ashuri and their respective underlings, but in the dancing, walking about, and other commotion, there was a great chance he could be bumped into, or that someone might feel his breath. Going in through the front doors would be difficult. Doable, if he was careful, but more dangerous than he preferred. His only other option was to sneak around the side of the palace and go in through the gardens. Much less dangerous, but it was certainly going to take him longer. if he didn't move quickly enough, there was the risk that one of his marks was going to get tired and go up to their chambers before he could escape with the loot he was after.
Fast,
Seto thought determinedly.
I can be fast.
Crouching low purely from instinct, Seto veered away from the sounds of music and laughter wafting out of the doors, away from the rich smells of good food and wine, and headed left into the darker recesses of the palace grounds. Despite being safely behind the high walls of the estate, the palace was guarded on all sides by patrolling sentries, but Seto wasn't bothered by them. Silently, he thanked the ancestors for his extraordinary gift and his good fortune in finding the magic ring. For as long as he could remember, Seto had held such power over illusions. As a boy, Seto experimented often with his power, finding that he was able to layer illusions more easily when he had hold of something like sand or dust, which he reasoned was a substance both present and not present, as dust barely existed at all. In the same manner, his illusions also just barely existed. With further practice and years of careful honing, Seto had grown adept in his power, always taking care to heed the physical warnings that he was pushing himself too hard. But in secret, of course, where no one else could know. He had always felt the need, even as a young child, to keep it secret, hidden from the rest of the world. Dert, Shanid, their mother Eldiu, none of them knew anything about Seto's power, and for some reason he couldn't put his finger on, Seto was loath to reveal it to them. Perhaps his secrecy stemmed from a fear of losing his adoptive father's respect. After all, making oneself completely invisible was definitely an unfair advantage as far as thievery was concerned, and if Dert knew Seto had such a power, he might not be so proud of his young ward's achievements in the criminal world. Shanid, Seto knew, would look upon such a power with the same opinion held by most all residents of Murul, but especially prevalent in the executioners, that Seto was a witch, and that he has sold away his soul to the Cursed Ones in exchange for it. Eldiu would most likely have a similar response to a lesser degree, but all of his family would certainly think less of him, Seto knew, were they to find out about his power. Religion in Murur was very strict, a fact Seto was aware of, and he knew the consequences of being accused of heresy, blasphemy, or witchcraft. Death by execution. Besides which, if one truly held fast to Morian beliefs, the soul of a heretic, a blasphemer, or a witch would be forever cast out from the ancestors and would become a tortured Cursed One, left to howl in agony endlessly in the afterworld. Seto wasn't sure about that. He'd long since abandoned the beliefs in the ancestors, Cursed Ones, or afterworld, deciding that any world that damned him for his power wasn't a world he wanted to believe in. The gardens were fenced off from the rest of the grounds by a high steel fence with a locked and chained gate. Luckily, the years of scraping by on the streets had left Seto thin and wiry, so slipping between the wide bars of the ornamental gate was an easy task. Once inside, he found the gardens to be much darker than the rest of the grounds, unlit by lanterns or the flaming torches carried by the sentries. Fire was too dangerous to be kept near such rare and exotic plant life, so the gardens were kept completely darkened in the evening hours. All the better for Seto's intended purpose. Relaxing his guard for just an instant, no one could be here at such a late hour, Seto dropped his illusion to catch his breath. Even with the ring, complete invisibility was taxing, and he could feel sweat beading on his forehead.
Just a little longer,
he whispered to himself quietly. He figured he was safe for the moment, and wouldn't need to hide himself again until he got inside the palace proper. Plunging into the plant life, Seto began to wander the twisting, winding paths of the gardens, looking for the back door into the palace. Despite his assurances to himself that no one was liable to come strolling through the gardens at this hour, he decided to stick to the shadows anyways, just in case he stumbled upon any star-crossed lovers ambling along. He didn't, much to his relief. After about a minute or so of stumbling blindly through the foliage and trying to tread as silently as possible, Seto found the door. It was wooden, probably imported to judge by the dark grain of the wood, and stood about 8 feet high, 4 feet across. Small enough to not compete with the massive main entryway, but large enough to befit someone as expansive and important as an Ashuri. Seto hoped it was unlocked, but if worse came to worse, he had ways of getting through locks. As he reached for the handle of the door to try and open it, Seto heard hushed voices on the other side of the door, and the handle started to turn of its own accord. Panicked, Seto didn't have time to make himself invisible again, and instead flattened himself against the wall beside the door so as to be hidden by it when it opened. Just in time, as the handle clicked and the door began to open. Inward.
I forgot to study the hinges,
Seto thought furiously, backpedaling along the wall to try and reach the cover of the gardens again before whoever was coming outside did so. Luckily, the man who had opened the door had been in deep conversation with someone else, and had waited a good few seconds after opening the door to step outside, still talking.
I'm telling you this for your own good, Baladin.
Baladin? Seto realized. As in Ashuri Baladin? Oh no. The stakes had just been raised tremendously. Just by listening in on a meeting between Ashuri would prove to be valuable in the criminal underworld. Information was as profitable as gold and silver these days, and Seto could become rich just by relaying simple words. But if he was caught, he would lose even more. To steal was punishable by the loss of a hand. To steal from an Ashuri would cost both hands. If a thief tried to run, he would lose a leg as well, but to spy upon the Ashuri, that would lose him his ears and tongue as well. Even if his father and mother were able to treat such awful wounds, Seto would never recover. He would become a worthless cripple, solely dependent on his family for support.
So don't get caught,
Seto instructed himself, trying to calm the chill that ran through him at the thought of losing his limbs. The Ashuri, however, had not noticed him yet, but continued speaking. Seto, frozen against the wall a few feet away from the safety of the gardens, held his breath. They were facing each other as they spoke, neither paying much attention to their surroundings. Neither of the two men noticed Seto, pressed against the wall. Whatever those damnable Northmen have been concocting behind the mountains, I want none of it, Baladin was saying. Seto had never seen the Ashuri before, choosing to usually run and hide during the man's public appearances, which were few and far in between. He took a moment to study him. Ashuri Baladin had been handsome in his youth, or so Seto had heard from his mother, but those days were long since past. The years had hardened him, made his face a craggy hatchet, set with a permanent scowl. His thick black hair had darkened to gray, and though he could still probably heft an executioner's sword with one arm, his belly had grown in the past years as well. Somehow, this added to his larger-than-life presence, adding more to his tall, powerfully built frame. He was, beyond a shadow of a doubt, a true ruler of a mighty nation. His stately robes and other garments were silken, flowing about him majestically, stirred by the gentle evening breeze. Seto could see that if they fell across him just right, the robes completely concealed his paunch. The other Ashuri, whom Seto could not identify, replied with something more soft-spoken that Seto could not make out. Despite his own inhibitions about getting caught, Seto's curiosity won out over caution, and he bent low to the earth to scoop up the handful of soil.
Hide me,
he breathed, and cast it into the air with as little actual motion as he could achieve, but the Ashuri saw it anyways. What was that? Baladin demanded, turning from his conversation to look in the direction of Seto. The thief's eyes met the ruler's, but behind his curtain of invisibility, Seto was safely hidden. All that Baladin could see was a slight stirring of dust in the breeze. Seto prayed that he didn't notice that the wind was blowing opposite the way the dust was falling, but Baladin, youngest of 7 brothers, had not become an Ashuri simply through looks and charisma.
What? I didn't see anything.
The other Ashuri leaned around Baladin to look at where Seto should have been as well. I did, Baladin growled, and Seto's heart hammered in his chest so violently he feared that Baladin could hear it.
Come now, Baladin. It must have just been the wind. There's clearly no one there. We've already found one would-be spy. The chances of there being 2 is unheard of.
The wind wasn't blowing east. Someone kicked up that dust and they're still here. I know it. Seto felt a sudden urge to run, to give up on this insane venture and return home safe and sound. But if he moved, Baladin would likely see his footprints in the dirt and noticed him.
Don't come over here. Please don't come over here,
he thought frantically, but Baladin was already striding towards where he stood. There was no way out. Nothing Seto did now could stop the Ashuri from finding him. But for some reason, Baladin paused just before he bumped into Seto. The young thief held his breath. "Perhaps you're right," Baladin conceded, turning from Seto to head back to the path and his companion. "What were we discussing?"
Seto let out a quiet sigh of relief and thanked the ancestors for his good fortune. He knew he shouldn't press his luck any further, but curiosity won out in the end over reason. He would get what he came for, but after he learned what the Ashuri were discussing. It was, after all, their party. What would cause them to leave it for a stroll in the gardens? Quiet as a mouse, Seto crept after the two.
"I don't trust Aurelia these days, Veralis. The Senate there is far too unstable, and it's impossible to know who's truly in control."
"If you ask me," Ashuri Veralis replied, "it's that Sasuke Runin. For a senator, he seems simply too powerful."
"But there's always the possibility that it's a ruse. Sasuke Runin may just be a facade for one of the other senators to hide behind. This aggression has to come from somewhere in Aurelian Senate, but I can't find where."
Seto's head spun. Aurelia was threatening Marur? Of course, only the nobility would have any knowledge of this, but now Seto was truly curious. Who was this Sasuke Runin, and what were the Aurelians after? "If I were you, Baladin, I would treat the Northerners with more caution than you have been. They've an envoy heading to Arad-Huir to meet with us tomorrow, as you well know. You've always been the cleverest of us. What do you plan to do?"
"I have a choice to make, Veralis. I can try to intimidate them, show them that we're strong and don't need to fear the North, but Aurelia is much larger than Marur. Even if they lack the quality of soldiers that we have, they have an enormous advantage in numbers."
"What's the other option?"
"I'd like to avoid war if possible. We have powerful allies in Turia, Korzil, and Sintil, not to mention Shatiz across the sea and her island colonies. But Aurelia is the largest country in the planet, and they have a foothold in the south through their friends in the Shatian colonies. I want to know what the Aurelians want with Marur, and if perhaps they're willing to ally themselves with us. If they can make a good enough offer, I'll hear them out. Our best bet would be to receive them with open arms and hospitality."
"But that could backfire as well, Baladin. They could take it as a sign that we're complacent, willing to do anything to please them."
"Which is why they're going to need to bargain wisely with me. Besides which, if Sasuke Runin really is behind the northern aggression, then I have something that he would like recovered very much."
"Oh? The Lost Lady of Tirabane?"
"Linsirasal Runin, Veralis, a northern maid of unparalleled value to her father. I've an idea as to where she may be."
"So if we can glean who this particular envoy is serving in the Senate, and it happens to be Senator Runin, we have leverage with him."
"Even if Runin isn't the instigator, we can still use his daughter to control him. And if he needs more convincing, I'll throw in one of my own daughters to sweeten the deal. Or yours."
"Of course. Any of my family would be willing to serve your purpose."
Veralis bowed his head respectfully.
"Did you have a particular lady in mind, Baladin?"
"My daughter Eliam is the loveliest maid of the south, is she not, Veralis?"
Veralis looked as though he was about to disagree, but held his tongue and nodded. "Indeed, I know of no woman more beautiful. You would marry her off to old Runin?"
"If it helps us gain a foothold in the north, yes."
Seto lost sight of the men around a bend and stood dumbly in shock. He had just overheard an entire overlay of everything happening between the north and south of the world. War could be brewing, he realized, and information the likes of which he'd just come across would be worth a fortune if he ever got out of here. Something else Ashuri Veralis had said had struck Seto as odd. He had spoken of someone else who had snuck into the palace and been caught. A spy, if he'd heard correctly. Unfortunate for them, Seto supposed, and if the guards were looking for an accomplice, they would be much more vigilant. He would have to remain invisible for the rest of his time inside the palace. Casting off the illusion to catch his breath, Seto leaned up against the wall near the door and breathed deeply to clear his head. "Focus," he told himself sternly. "Remember what you heard for later, but for now, think only of the task at hand." With one more deep breath before the plunge, Seto closed one hand over the door handle, turned it, and pushed, letting the door creak back on its hinges. He waited a moment to see if any servants or butlers would come running towards the sound, but no one came. With a sigh of relief, Seto darted inside the door and slowly shut it behind him.
The interior of the palace was well lit, even down here by the gardens. Seto's boots rested on fine mosaic tiling depicting the past battles and great deeds of Ashuri long since gone. Oiled lamps hung from the high arched ceiling and shone flickering yellow light over the smooth alabaster walls of the palace interior. Any other thief would have been dismayed by the bright light of the lamps, but Seto didn't fear being seen. At the moment, the corridor was completely empty, devoid of any guards, servants, or guests. Seto was completely alone, but now he ran into another problem. Where to go from here? He knew the exterior of the palace by heart. It was a relatively simple place to navigate, but he had never been inside before. He had only peered at the spires from a distance. Judging by where he was in relation with the main gates, Seto knew that he would have to reach the main hall to find the staircases up to the 4 towers. The center, 5th tower, belonged to Ashuri Baladin and his family, while the other 4 were loaned out to accommodate the other 4 Ashuri families, but the center tower was the one that fascinated Seto the most. This was Ashuri Baladin's palace, so the richest treasures would be in his living quarters. The only problem was, the winding spiral staircase up to the center tower was located behind the Great Hall. He would most likely have to pass through the party itself just to reach it. Side corridors and passageways could take him to the other 4 towers, but the other Ashuri wouldn't have anything else with them that Seto was interested in. He supposed there was no true reward without risk, as Dert was wont to say, and Seto steeled himself for the trial ahead before plunging into the hallway. It took almost another 20 minutes just to follow the sounds and smells to the Great Hall, but Seto made his way there eventually, occasionally having to slip past a servant passing by. The sound of music was almost drowned out by the deafening chatter of the Blue Bloods, and Seto wondered why the musicians even bothered trying. He spotted the Lana Ashuri, sitting together at the high table, with 3 other Ashuri men, but of course Baladin and Veralis were missing. Lana Ashuri Baladin, sitting alone beside her husband's chair, had turned her full attention to her meal, but seemed only to be picking at it without appetite. Every now and again she would speak with one of the other Lana Ashuri beside her, but she mainly appeared listless and unhappy. She was, Seto noted curiously, a Turian woman. It was common knowledge that Baladin had chosen his wife out of the swamplands just north of Marur's deserts, but he had never seen the woman without her veil, which was worn always when in view of the public, as was custom. She was as slender as the day Baladin had taken her to wife, perhaps even a bit more so, and childbearing had taken its toll on her. Perhaps once she had been the loveliest woman from Marur all the way to the Serpent's Tongue, but now she had aged, to be considered only mildly attractive. Her hair had been fair, Seto remembered from when he had seen her as a youth, but it had whitened considerably due to a combination of age and the merciless sun. She wore the red and gold livery of the Ashuri and of Marur, in a gown that wrapped her snug but fell in concealing waves over her body, emphasizing her slenderness without seeming to flaunt it. Seto wondered if her daughters retained the same beauty that she had become famous for in the south, but didn't have to wonder for long. Amid the dancing, a single couple broke off and headed for the high table. Seto recognized one of the daughters of the Lana Ashuri Baladin instantly for her extraordinary loveliness, trailing a young dark-skinned nobleman behind her. Her pretty face showed signs of weariness, and she leaned in to speak with her mother. The Lana Ashuri nodded to her daughter, the Lina Ashuri, and the young woman headed for the doors along the sides of the great hall, dragging her feet wearily. The young nobleman bowed briefly to her, and then headed back amid the dancers. Seto recognized an opportunity when he saw one, and dashed across the edges of the room, far away from the dancers to trail behind her. The Lina Ashuri turned as he approached, somehow sensing someone behind her, but looked right through Seto and saw no one. The great gilded doors to the staircases were flung wide, and the Lina Ashuri moved through them quicker than before, seemingly in a hurry to escape the party, and started up the stairs. Seto was careful to try and match his footfalls to hers in order to not give himself away. The stairs stretched ever upwards in a great spiral, joining with its sister staircase in an intricate helix, twisting around one another in a silent, still dance up to the roof of the dome that topped the grand hall, and up into the more constrictive confines of the center tower. The Lina Ashuri led Seto up and up through the tower, every so often passing a small angular window through which Seto could look out over the entirety of Arad Huir. He could see the city limits from here, marked by nothing save for the occasional watchtower, mimicking the palace's great soaring spires. No walls constricted the city itself, as the Ashuri cared only to protect the palace, the center of their power. Under siege, the city could be flooded with foes, but the populace, those that made it in time, would be safely ensconced within the palace walls to serve as makeshift defenders. Those soldiers cloistered within the watchtowers around the city's edge could send rifle and cannon shot down into the city below to disrupt their enemies' movements without fearing the death of civilians. The watchtowers themselves, however, had no defense other than the men inside of them. Luckily, the tight staircases made it easy to fend off attackers and retain the tower's integrity. Meanwhile, the Lin Ashuri was nearing the top of the staircase, where the tower spread out into a spacious living space containing quarters for all members of the Shuri Baladin's family and a small sleeping space for his personal executioner. The tower was darkened when Seto and the Lin Ashuri entered, but the young woman lit up a lamp without much trouble and made for one of the baths. Seto waited until the satin curtains had been drawn across the washroom and then let drop his illusion. He was sweating profusely now, and his breath was short, but he had made it. Almost as soon as he had become visible, Seto heard the sounds of footsteps on the stairs and ducked into a shadowy alcove just as 3 more young women entered the tower. Dressed identically in matching white gowns, Seto identified them easily as the Lin Ashuri's handmaidens, here to tend to her every need before she bedded down for the night. Seto resisted the urge to curse vehemently. He needed to make this fast before Baladin and the Lana Ashuri decided to come to bed as well. "In here, ladies," came the Lin Ashuri's lazy voice from the baths, and the young veiled maidens hastened to her voice. Seto heard the Lin Ashuri call for hot water to be drawn for her bath, and the curtain parted just long enough for the handmaids to slip out and make for the stairwell again. No doubt that when they returned, it would be with vases of hot water. Seto would have to make his move and leave before then. The moment the handmaiden's footsteps grew faint on the staircase, he crept out from his hiding place and slipped past the curtain, ignoring the sounds of the Lin Ashuri patiently humming to herself and trying not to think about the fact that she was likely to be naked just beyond the curtain. "You're here to steal, you fool, not ogle women," Seto reprimanded himself sternly, and he turned for the curtain on the right, leading to what he assumed were the Ashuri's chambers where he and his wife would sleep. The curtain rustled aside almost noiselessly, and Seto crept inside, straining his eyes against the dark. It was difficult to see, as he had no lamp, but the light of the moon and stars through the window helped him in his endeavor. He soon realized that he had made a serious mistake in entering this room. He had assumed that it was the Ashuri's, but it seemed to instead belong to Baladin's personal executioner. It was a sparse room, all things considered, bearing only a cot mounted against a wall and a small 3-legged table. The cot was bare of sheets or blankets, or even a pillow for the executioner's head. In fact, it was more akin to a wooden altar against the wall than a bed. Seto could almost imagine the way the executioner would lie there, his hands folded over his chest, staring up unblinking at the ceiling as he waited for sleep to claim him. Executioners and their discipline, Seto chuckled softly. A man could be disciplined without having to lie on a plank every night when he could have a real bed. Upon this simple little table sat a small pewter bowl and cup, beside a wooden platter. A hunk of stale-looking bread sat upon the platter, and a thin broth sloshed in the bowl. The cup contained simple water, no wine, as executioners refused to consume anything that they did not deem to be pure. "I'm not going to find anything in here," Seto thought distastefully, and made for the curtain, but the sounds of the handmaids returning stopped him in his tracks. Damn, but those girls were fast. He waited while the maids drew the Lin Ashuri's bath, and listened to the sounds of her splashing about for a minute or so until the washroom was still and only the hushed sounds of the 4 women talking and gossiping reached his ears. They were all in there, or so he imagined, but he peered into their common room just under the curtain, just to be safe. Yes, there was no one there, Seto saw, and he drew the curtain aside, ghosting across the room to where another curtain waited. Drawing it aside, Seto entered and had to stop himself from gasping in sudden surprise. This was it. He had found the Ashuri's living quarters. The room was almost 5 times the size of the tiny executioner's cell, and 100 times more lavish. The bed was low to the ground, a soft mound of pillows, sheets, and other plush. The curtains on the other end of the room made way to a vast balcony overlooking the entire city and surrounding area. The closets held dozens of sets of robes, gowns, and other garments that the Ashuri and his wife shared, while the tiled floor was covered with a lush rug. The bed was even hung with silken drapery to shroud the couple as they slept. The ceiling was high and domed in shape, as the pinnacle of the palace. Lit in a circle around the perimeter of the room were torches rather than lamps, lighting the bedroom with flickering, lusty light. But it was the nightstand that Seto was most interested in. The top of the small marble pedestal beside the bed was covered in the personal possessions of the Ashuri and Lana Ashuri. The Lana's jewelry would fetch Seto a handsome price in the black markets of Arad Huir, and the Ashuri's gold chains and rings would only add to that. Besides which, there was plenty more to steal sitting on the vanity on the other side of the room. The Lana Ashuri's perfumes and spices, cinnamon and myrrh, ointments and pins for her hair. All of these would accumulate into an astronomical profit, assuming he could fit it all within his satchel. His rustic was almost stuffed by the time he was finished looting, but he didn't take everything. Seto was a thief, but he wasn't a cruel man, and he figured even if the Ashuri were rulers of a nation, people who could easily replace whatever he took, it would be outside the realm of his scruples to simply steal from them with abandon. Besides, he thought devilishly, I have yet to look in their daughters' rooms. Almost as he said it, he heard sloshing as the Lin Ashuri lifted herself from the baths and her handmaidens hurried to dry her. Seto knew he didn't have much time, and so rushed from one bedchamber to another, hoping none of the other Lin Ashuri decided to come to bed before the one he was stuck with left the baths. This was hard enough, avoiding one Lin Ashuri and her maids. 2 would be beastly. He took the next few minutes slowly, examining each room one after the other and keeping clear of the Lin Ashuri as she bedded down. The handmaidens left, and the lamp in the last Lin Ashuri's bedchamber had gone out by the time Seto exited the next room, his bag bulging. There were a few rooms left to search, but Seto wasn't sure which one the Lin Ashuri was laying in. If he accidentally walked in on her, she would raise the alarm, the guards would come, get the wrong idea as to what Seto was doing up here, and he could add castration to the list of punishments he would receive. By the cursed ones, it was entirely possible that he'd just be sentenced to death. He did his best to convince himself that excitement about being rich was what was making his hands shake so furiously. Picking a room, Seto headed inside. There was no dust for him to use in here, so he couldn't become invisible. If this was the wrong room, he had no way to hide. It was the wrong room. There, lying in her lavish bed, dressed only in a flimsy nightgown, was the Lin Ashuri. Seto froze, panic rising in his throat, before he realized that, despite having only just gotten into bed, the young woman was already asleep. Leave now, part of him said. Leave now with what you have and get out of here. But the curiosity in Seto was piqued. He had never seen a Lin Ashuri up close before. He had seen them ride past the crowds upon entering the city, but all of the women had been swathed in cloths and veiled. Now was his chance to see what a noble woman looked like without all the finery of class. Creeping closer, Seto looked into the bed. A pretty Turian face, high cheekbones and narrow nose of a Turian, mixed in with the Morian heritage her father bestowed upon her to give her skin an odd but not at all unattractive tone to it. Not nearly as fair as Seto, she was not as dark as the traditional Morian either. Her skin colored a deep olive tan that contrasted to her white nightgown. Her lush lips were full and her bosom had ripened with womanhood, tapering along her sides to the camber of her hips. Seto was amazed. He had expected that, beneath all their finery, the Ashuri were still just like him and his fellows, but it seemed he had been wrong. This was no skinny, tough-skinned working girl, but a true lady of a noble house. He felt odd and unclean looking at her like this, and made to leave, content with what he'd seen, but here was when his luck ran short. As he turned, Seto's toes caught in the edges of the rug on the floor, and he tripped, staggering off balance for a few seconds before hitting the wall with a thud. The breath rushed out of his body in a wheezing grunt, and immediately the Lin Ashuri stirred in bed. "Hello? Father, is that you?" Her voice lilted from behind the drapes of her bed. Now he was in trouble. Frantic, Seto tore past the curtain and out into the common, trying to find a place to hide. In the end, he was too slow. There was a click behind him, and the Lin Ashuri's shaking voice sounded over his right shoulder. "Do not move." He felt cold iron pressed against the back of his neck. She had a gun, a pistol, probably ornamental, but Seto didn't want to find out. On the other hand, there was no way he was going to let himself be arrested, especially by a girl after he had come so far. Slowly, he lifted his hands in a universal gesture for peace.
I said don't move!
Her voice was shrill with fear. He terrified her. Good, he could use that. Relax, he said evenly, trying to keep the quaver out of his own voice. If her fingers so much as twitched on the trigger, I'm not here to hurt you. He moved, twisting around to knock the gun aside and getting close beside her. She screamed. Not fast enough. The pistol barrel flew aside as he made for her, but her arm had been so stiff with holding it that it rocketed right back and slammed into the side of Seto's head just above his right ear. He let out a grunt and staggered sideways, just missing her. The Lindashuri let out a squeak of surprise, as if she were amazed she had actually struck him, and then she swung the gun again. Seto tried to duck, but his ears were ringing and he was too slow. The pistol barrel smashed against his head again, and Seto could feel blood on his jaw running down his neck. His head spun, his vision was blurry. He whirled, trying to make one last lunge at the girl, but she was ready this time. The last thing Seto saw was the determined look on her face as she swung overhead into his face, and he felt himself crumpling to the floor as soldiers' booted feet mounted the stairs and came for him. This has been the first chapter of The Nothing Gate by Ben Nelson. If you guys want to get a closer look at some later chapters and maybe get a chance to get a physical copy, consider taking a look at my Patreon page. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed, and a big thank you to everyone who still supports me on Patreon, and all of you who may end up doing so in the future. Your support is what allows me to continue doing this work. Thank you.